As was stated earlier, not all governments behave the same, and not all governments are equally barbaric. Neither is every form of government equally likely to come about. For instance, it is obvious that any institution that lends itself to expropriation must maintain a monopoly to both ensure its victims must cooperate, and also to eliminate competition that could violently overthrow them. So subsequently, in order for the state to do this, it must carve into the minds of the public a sense of legitimacy, so the masses see its predation as justice and its victims are kept defenseless. And it is for this reason that all governments begin small and gradually expand. This is why the history of states didn't start with empires or world governments. In contrast, people of a tribe or commune would only trust those they know and have democratically elected to govern them rather than the globally reaching anonymous bureaucrats we're subject to today. Moreover, a particular way this happens in any anarchic society is through elites emerging from a diversity of intelligence, skills, wealth, and ability, and the elites essentially establishing a monopoly that is considered legitimate by their peers through their excellence. Naturally, to quote De Journal, there are men that see themselves as ascendant to others, and they will then inspire others with trust in themselves. Now, of course, the most desirable monopoly for elites and natural figures of authority is a monopoly on the judicial system, while also as these monopolies are the result of these individuals' elitist characters and achievements, it makes sense for them to ascribe some sort of ownership over these monopolies. Thus, these primordial states are monarchic. They are ruled personally and privately, which is contrasted by democratic rule, in which the state is supposedly owned publicly, yet still, the democratic politicians will act in their own self-interest. Although they do not own the state, and are not seen as owning the state, they still govern personally and in their own interests. Thus, their authority is in some sense artificial. That is to say, it won't arise naturally, rather they must do so through revolutions and wars. But nonetheless, the democratic politician does not and is not seen to own the state monopoly they were elected to govern, but rather are the temporary caretakers or trustees. And this difference in public ownership, that is, democracy and private ownership or monarchy, have very different effects on time preference and thus on the state of civilization. However, in contrast to the status quo, the security of civilization fell greatly when the world transitioned from monarchy to democracy. To illustrate, the time preference of a monarch is far lower than that of a democratic politician for the fundamental reason that the wealth they expropriate is not said to be owned by everyone, but is owned individually by the monarch as a part of their estate. Thus, the monarch is entitled to selling and buying parts of his estate, while is also able to pass on his estate to his heirs. And this difference in ownership confronts the monarch with a very different set of economic incentives, as unlike the democratic politician, it is in the monarch's interest to increase his current income only if there is no proportionate drop in the value of his estate, as again, the estate is his personal property rather than something that is owned by everyone, while also as expropriating necessarily decreases its value through disincentivizing the production of those living under his rule. The monarch is faced with a far greater degree of economic calculations that's results he is privately responsible for. Thus, the time preference of the monarch is far lower than that of the democratic politician. But moreover, the monarch, as any government, hinges on a parasitic relationship with the non-government public through the predation of producers. So nonetheless, the monarch must consider, if no one produces, there will be no wealth for the monarch to expropriate, while if all wealth is expropriated, there will be no wealth to expropriate in the future. Hence it is in the king's interest to tax low, as these two outcomes would substantially decrease the value of his estate. So the monarch instead seeks to expropriate a growing producing population, achieved only through lower taxes. This is easily seen through the public sector's income increasing drastically in the 19th century, the century of democracy. Prior to then, public income was only 5% of national income, while also up until the 19th century, only the United Kingdom had an income tax, and as the monarch seeks to increase the value of his estate, while also wishes to incentivize production, the judicial monopoly will be used to enforce a system of private property, enabling producers to create the wealth needed for expropriation. In fact, the monarch will want all income to be achieved productively. Hence, private property violations will be criminalized. This is echoed in the oath of the first French kings, quote, "I will honor and preserve each one of you, and I will maintain for each the law and justice pertaining to him," end quote. In fact, the King of France was referred to as the debtor of justice, and it is worth remembering that anything that is privately owned comes with the right of exclusion. Therefore, the monarch has the liberty of excluding anyone he chooses from the life of parasitism that he enjoys. Perhaps his family will be included, but the monarch has zero incentive to allow anyone to relish in the wealth expropriated from productive society, thus further minimizing the extent of state parasitism. And when it comes to the size of the king's family, the estate will be divided and inherited by who the monarch chooses, and with more family members comes a greater division of the king's lot, further incentivizing his heirs to keep his family highly exclusive. And with such an exclusive ruling class comes certain ideological circumstances. As there exists no upward mobility for the non-government public, their class consciousness is greatly enhanced. There is a clear dichotomy of the ruled and the non-ruled, with little hope for people to move from one class to the next. Hence, the solidarity of the ruled tends to be vast, with very high risk of the state losing its legitimacy when the monarch oversteps the boundaries set by the public, such as excessive taxation. For this reason, it was commonplace that the king would reward and negotiate with those he ruled over, such as John the Good of France being subsidized to keep the king's treasury intact, or when kings would travel around the town assembling those he was financially reliant on, such as during the eve of the 100-Year War. In addition, although a monarchism is by no means anti-war, the financial burden of military conflict is far more endearing. While also if any war is seen by the public as not theirs, it will surely threaten the legitimacy of the ruling class. Contractual solutions to conflicts are vastly preferable, whether this be through buying land or through marriage between the ruling class of another territory. Under monarchism, expansion may involve military conflict, but it is mostly the process of contractual conjunctions between already existing independent kingdoms, as was the case under the Habsburgs of Austria, an empire that expanded into the Netherlands and the western extremities through Maximilian marrying the heirs of the Dukes of Burgundy, or his son Philip, who married the heirs of Ferdinand in Spain, moreover expanding his estate into Spanish America, the Mediterranean, and Italy, and so on. However, all of this is only the result of privately owned government. When ownership is made public, a whole array of different incentives emerge, incentives that strengthen the process of de-civilization. If we look at the democratic politician, he is free to use the state to his advantage. However, he does not own it. He cannot sell parts of it, nor can anyone inherit it from him. He has authority over the state apparatus, but he has no ownership over the capital value of it. He has the ability to use the state, but has no ownership over its capital stock. Under democracy, we are left with a dilemma. The democratic politician has no interest in maximizing the wealth of the state, nor the value of it, because he doesn't own it. But his personal income is another matter. Even if he wanted to maximize the value of the state, he could not, as the nature of public property prohibits market prices and thus economic calculation. And if you want to know more about this economic calculation problem, I do have another video on it in the description, but I'd also recommend Googling it. But anyway, the nature of public ownership is one of continuous capital consumption, as it is impossible to preserve the capital stock or increase the estate's value in any way. Additionally, unlike the king, the democratic politician, rather than owning the state, is the temporary caretaker, and thus what he does not consume now, he will not be able to consume later. So subsequently, it is in his interest to consume as many resources as possible. This combined with the inability for the politician to reap the value of the state like under private rule, while being more than able to reap the benefits of higher income. This means the politician has little reason not to ruin his country in order to achieve a higher salary. In addition, the class consciousness of the public, non-government class is vastly diminished, as unlike under monarchism where the ruling class is highly exclusive, under democracy everyone is under the impression that they can enter the ruling class through the democratic process. Therefore, the public are under the illusion that rather than being ruled by somebody, they are ruled by themselves, an illusion that is greatly responsible for the widespread view that the transition from monarchy to democracy was progress. While also as the ruling class becomes more inclusive, Unlike under monarchism, the public are more likely to submit to heavy taxation, as the possibility of finding oneself on the receiving end of such a parasitic relationship is much greater, which also explains why the public sector has a tendency to grow and people with high time preferences are attracted to public servitude, effectively subsidizing low time preferences. Tax rates tend to rise as well as increases in the government money supply, while also all of these policies inevitably lead to ever-increasing public debt. While remembering that the monarch is the private owner of an estate and is hence liable for all debts incurred, the democratic politician has no responsibility for the debts incurred by his policies. Rather, his debts are supposedly paid back in the future by equally non-liable future governments, furthermore incentivizing an increase in debt that will result in increased taxation and inflation to repay it. And with future debt, the money supply and future taxation always being expected to rise, there is heavy incentive for the public to raise their time preference and consume as many goods as quickly as they can. This is clearly observable through national debt in the Western world never being lower than 30% of national output, while frequently surpassing 100%. Secondly, this facet of democracy can really be characterized by how steadfast the newly democratic world gave up commodity money, repealing the gold standard and enabling the state to expand the money supply for no cost. As under monarchism, where commodity money was the norm, inflation or expanding the money supply was not an option, while every attempt at fiat currency under monarchism failed drastically, even over various periods from 1694 to 1821, when the Bank of England suspended specie payment, or in other words, payments on gold and silver in exchange for currency, and similar such activities by the Bank of Amsterdam and others. It all resulted in the collapse of the Dutch tulip mania in 1637 and the Mississippi bubble and the South Sea bubble in 1720. It was only under the anonymous group rule of democratic republicanism that they could achieve what the monarchs could not, that is, irredeemable paper money. While also, under monarchism, there is a wealth of evidence that the long-run trend was for prices to fall and purchasing power to rise, with the exception of war times and gold discoveries. If one turns to B.R. Mitchell's text Abstract of British Historical Statistics, published in 1962, and European Historical Statistics 1750 to 1970, published in 1978, his texts conclude that prices were substantially lower in Europe during 1760 than they were in 1660, while yet again lowering drastically in 1860 from 1760, and this trend would only come to a halt when democracy spread across Europe. In only 20 years of fiat money, the consumer price index in the US rose from 40 in 1971 to 136 in 1991. In the United Kingdom, it climbed from 24 to 157. In France, from 30 to 137, and in Germany from 56 to 116. Similarly, from 1845 to the end of World War I, the money supply in Britain increased 6 times over, while in the United States from 1918 to 1991, the money supply increased by 64 times. Thus, we can see that the monarch, as the state's private owner, has a systematically longer planning horizon. His time preference is lower, and thus his degree of expropriation is also lower than the democratically elected politician or government caretaker. While the same can be said of the general public, with a larger system of systematic expropriation under democracy, the public's time preference will systematically increase, while also the monarch values the state's assets as they belong to him, while the democratic politician does not, as he is merely its caretaker for a given period of time. Thus, the monarch will not want to increase his income at the expense of his assets. However, the politician will, as firstly, the state's assets are owned publicly, and thus he is not financially responsible or liable for his decisions, while secondly, what he doesn't consume in the present, he will not be able to consume in the future, as I said earlier. While additionally, the monopoly on law maintained by a democratic bureaucracy operates very differently from one maintained by a monarch. Under monarchism, the king inherits an age-old law of private property. He does not legislate or bring new laws into existence. Rather, he occupies a privileged status within a pre-existing system of private property. With the exception of the Protestant revolutions and the Renaissance, laws were seen as something to be given rather than something to be made. However, with the rise of democracy comes the rise of positive law, laws that the state enacts not just to redistribute wealth from society onto itself, but also redistributes wealth within civil society, as again the productivity of society is of no concern to the democratic politician, and thus there is no logical obstacle stopping the democratic politicians from engaging in mass redistributionism.